Hello! In today's video, I'm going to talk about crunching numbers. Now, like I've said before, math needs to work in the real world. So I am always testing the mathematics I use against engines that are run to see if it comes out correctly. And I have shown some of this in previous videos. In the CFM demand, one of the things that came up was about volumetric efficiency. And I did a video on volumetric efficiency. Now, some people are questioning the fact that I am not considering CFM as part of volumetric efficiency. And I said several things in the volumetric efficiency video about inertia RAM. And my understanding of inertia RAM gives me a little better insight on some of this. There's still a lot of people out there that either don't even know this exists or they're calling it some sort of magic wave because they don't know it's actually inertia RAM. And then there's others that just mistake it for the Helmholtz wave tuning, and that's a whole other thing which I've also done a video on. The basics, I said, in inertia RAM is that the camshaft gives you a Z number that's basically volumetric efficiency. So I went out and looked for a video that would have a dyno run showing that, because I don't necessarily have time or resources to go do a run on my own. The dyno we have at work is busy with motors that we have built that we need to break in the cam, we need to make sure the motor's okay, leak free, making the number we told them it would make. I might be able to do, an intake change or carb change. Once in a great while, I guess wrong on a cam, usually at the bottom end. It's a little too aggressive and they need a little more bottom end than it made. So I got to swap out the cam. But that's really all we do. I am not a R&D shop. I am a bread and butter, making motors, getting them out the door to people and trying to make them what they want, what they need. And so I don't always have the time to test. And this is why I personally enjoy watching like Richard Holdner and Eric Weingartner in the testing they do. They show trends, they show lots of things. They also give me lots of math that I can do to hone what I know. And the CFM demand that has happened is the same way. And so I have been using it on all sorts of stuff to see if it gives me the RPM with the basic flow that I know we have when I have data to do it all. And this new formula that I came up with that is in CFM demand volume 3 is very accurate. I've done it against a bunch of engines. And so I am very comfortable with that working. Now the problem people have is I don't have volumetric efficiency in that. And in the VE video, I talked about what. So I decided to go out and see if I could find something to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Now in this case, I've used Eric Weingartner for the data. And I love Eric dearly, and you really ought to watch his videos because he gives you all the information. He tries really hard to not change a bunch of stuff all at once. And so it's really good data. And Richard Holder does a lot of the same things, but he tends to look more towards giving you trends. This is kind of what you will see happen if you do this. And that a lot of times is some good basic information. And when I worked with him on the Cadillac videos that we did at Cadco with Courtney, I had great fun. And we actually got to play and run. And With Courtney, we didn't get to do that a lot. I did do that with some intake testing, but like I said, we have a lot of regular work we have to get done. So you can take this with a grain of sand. The numbers are from Eric. You can go look them up. I tried to find a head test where the heads were way different, and yet everything else was the same. And that's actually an unusual test. And so in this case, it's a 408 LS that he uses as a dyno mill. And he started out with a standard 243 head that he ported. And so that was his starting point. And it has a fairly big cam in it. It's a Texas speed cam, and it has a Z01. Remember, that equates out to what I said is basically a 100% volumetric efficiency. Z of 1, Z and volumetric efficiency are kind of hand in hand. They're not perfect, and I'm going to show that. But it gets you in the right neighborhood of where you should be. So with that Z of 1, a good carb, and a good size intake. One of the problems with a lot of tests is you got to watch that they don't make some other fundamental mistake. They put on an intake that's too small, or they put on a carb that's too small. You know, they mismatch it enough that the data is compromised. You're looking at the carb size as opposed to the head flow. And so that's another thing I like about Eric is he is pretty good. I mean, he has done engine masters, and he has a good, strong base information of what works together, especially on these bigger motors, which is what he likes. So in this case, like I said, it's a 243 OE LS head. He's running a Victor Junior intake, 1000 CFM carb. So the intake's not super huge, and the carb is decent sized, which for the dyno is fine. On this head, ported, he went to a bigger valve. He wound up with 305 CFM at max lift, and 238 cc and 5.43 long runner. So that starts giving you some of the basic information. Now, the cross section on this is only 2.57. So that is probably going to be a restriction, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the other problem, because there's two separate heads, this is two different heads tested on the same motor with everything else the same, as much as he could pull off. This is a regular cathedral port head on an LS. This is a rectangular port head, so that we do have a slight difference in intake, because the intake is meant to match the cylinder head. But it's still a Victor Junior intake. So we have to look at that too in what we're reviewing here. Now, the other problem he has is this one is coming out to 11.8 to 1 compression. So this one has got a different chamber. It's only 11.1 compression. So I'm going to have to deal in my math with the compression of the motor. So the 243 head made 618.5 horsepower at 6,500 RPM. Now, part of the reason I chose Eric is because when he does a lot of these tests, he actually has the air hat put on. Now at Cadco, we don't tend to do that. We're breaking in engines, we're making sure they make a number. Courtney always felt it was a bit of a pain and useless information, so we just didn't really use it. And on this upcoming camshaft test that I'm going to do, I probably ought to put it back on, make sure it's calibrated, make sure it's reading right, and see what the difference is when I swap cams. Because that cam test is kind of a volumetric efficiency test. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to boost the volumetric efficiency. So we have a cross section with, if I use 108, because this is a standard OE thing, that comes out to like 277 CFM. And that's probably more realistic than the 305. And that's what I've told you before, especially on these OE heads. The restriction is usually the push rod that we struggle with more than the valve itself. So with 618.5 horsepower, if I take that compression out, if I take that 11.8 to 1 compression out, which is about 11.4% of the power is coming from the compression, that comes out to 555 horsepower. That's 266.8 CFM. So let's talk about that. Our number that we said we had flow-wise was at least 277, because I don't think it'll live up to the 305. But for usage, we're not even using that. We're only using 266.8. Now if you look here, this is at 99.4% VE at peak horsepower. At peak torque, it's at 100.7. Well, I said it was a Z01. I said that the camshaft will follow the basic neighborhood of what volumetric efficiency is going to be. It's about the closing point and the time, like I said in volumetric efficiency. And that shows up here. We are right in that 100 volumetric efficiency. So why didn't we use more airflow? Well, if we use CFM demand, and that's what it's meant for, is where is our limit in CFM demand? Well, we look at CFM demand at 6,500, because that's where peak horsepower happened. That comes out to 270 CFM. Now, we are basically there. I mean, this is 267, and this is 270. So you can see that is getting substantially more accurate. Just a little bit different would give us a slightly bigger number. We can see that basically with what we're doing, that the Z is the first big chunk of where you'll be in volumetric efficiency. Now, there are other pieces. There is some breathing and how it happens that can occur. And I've talked about this before. If you don't get the fill started well up here, if there's something in the camshaft and you're not getting a good start up here, you run out of time to get a big fill. And you can certainly wind up with a lower number than what you should be. But basically, if you're at a Z of 1 on a particular cam, and you put it on a dyno with a hat, you ought to be looking at right around 100% volumetric efficiency. It should be in that neighborhood. Otherwise, you got to question what's going on. So, if we look at this, we are all in the neighborhood. The CFM demand works, it's darn close. And the volumetric efficiency works. Now, you're going to say, well, that's working because you made that 100% VE. And this is working because this is 100% VE. Well, that could be true. So let's look at the head swap. Now, this head is an AFR. And we lost compression, but this is a much better head. This is a substantially better design. It's a raised runner. It has a 208 valve. It has a well-designed port. If you look, the CC isn't a lot bigger, even though it's got a longer runner. And its cross-section at the pinch point is 2.9. The place that this head has a restriction is at the valve itself, which is where you want it. This is a much nicer head. And that's part of the reason I chose this particular one. So we have a substantial difference in head that we're running on the same motor. Now, basically, I feel it has about a 2.59 square inch at the valve. Considering I don't know the percentage of throat, he didn't give me quite all the information. I know the pinch point is big, the rest of the port isn't a problem. So just figuring some general deals, I wind up at about 2.59. Now, that is a little bit bigger than the cross section we had up here. Now, what happened to power? What occurred? Well, if you look at this, we made 641 at 6,600. So we're up horsepower. But remember, we're also down on compression. So we actually did pretty well. And it's now sitting at 103.9 VE. Much better volumetric efficiency. But notice we're still in that 100% range, that zone. So if I take out this compression, which is only 9.3% of the power, that brings us to 586 horsepower from air. That comes out to about 281.7 CFM. Now we went up 100 RPM. And so the CFM demand at 6,600 instead of 65 is now 274. And so that demand is lower than the horsepower we made from CFM, from air. And so the question is why? But if you take this 103.9% volumetric efficiency and you add that to the 274, that gives you 287 CFM that you have available at 103.9 VE. And you're like, well, so VE needs to be in there. VE needs to be in there after the fact. If you put VE in this part of the formula up here, you're going to affect the RPM. You're going to change where the RPM is, and then your number makes less sense. VE is going to be after the fact. So if you figure CFM demand and you get a flow number, you can then know that's the RPM you'll be at. But you can use the VE to decide how much horsepower. Now if I was running a regular cam and I was only at 85% volumetric efficiency, I'd have to take 85% of that number. If I was running a much bigger cam, 274 or something, I might be up at 110, 112. That all depends on what my Z is to get me a basic idea of where I should be at in the way of horsepower and where I should be at in VE. Now you can see there is a little bit of variance because this is a much better head. Up here, we were just barely at that 100% VE. Down here, for peak torque, we're at 105. And it actually went to 105.4 at 5,600, which wasn't where peak torque actually occurred. And if you look up here, that happened too. This one was 5,000 RPM, but you're really starting to talk sometimes onesie-twosies. It could be testing, it could be a slight mixture variation. There's all sorts of things that can kill just a few horsepower and throw you off. But their meter was showing 102 worth of air moving at 5,400. And down here, we were at 5,600. So this one is lower, that one is higher, and you can see the motor is basically peaking kind of in the middle. It's just we don't quite see it depending on what's going on. And that's because a lot of it is based off of CFM demand and just CID and RPM. And how the head flows doesn't completely change that. The flow number, if you have a big head, big flow, some of this is about airspeed. If you do that, RPM goes up because you need to meet that CFM. Now, once you're past meeting the RPM demand, then your horsepower can still go up with volumetric efficiency, which is why that shouldn't have it. So, and that's what I'm trying to do with my cam tests that I want to run. Now I got the camshaft in, but I have to do a couple of prep things and see if I can basically trick the motor into a higher VE. And the problem with some of this is, remember, VE is here at peak torque. Now, I may have trouble down here. It could be a disaster. Pulse pack may kill me. It may be a bad idea. Because normally you don't put a really big cam in a basically nothing motor. You just don't do it. I am trying to use it as a band-aid to trick it into doing something I want to do, because I'm hoping I understand all this well enough that I can make that happen. The problem is, all of this math that I'm doing is about peak. It's about peak. And I don't know necessarily what happens down here, because down here I may not have enough airspeed to carry it. In which case I may have to either try a different intake, see if I can bump up the airspeed, or we may just have to make it a motor that functions higher up, and for the OE stuff it's just a bad idea. So that's where we'll go. But that's why I crunch numbers and try and make sure that it fits my understanding of how things are. And I will continue crunching numbers. This is just one example. It's just the one I picked out, and it worked out pretty decently right away, and tells me that I am probably correct in that VE has no business in the actual formula. VE is something that happens after the fact because it's about the cam. It's about the closing point. It's about the fill, not about the different RPM. If you increase the flow, the RPM will go up. That's what that says. You increase the flow, RPM has to be higher. And that's what that formula says. And that's why I try and use these to my advantage. So that's just me crunching numbers. I know it's kind of boring stuff. This is a bit of a hobby of mine that I like to process all the numbers I can find and make sure my understanding is correct with what we see in the world. Because mathematics is only good as the result being real world. If the result is not real world, you're just making up stuff. So that's me crunching numbers. If I took up your time and it didn't interest you, I'm sorry. I like it. But I will keep crunching numbers, and I will think about what I'm going to do on my camshaft test, because that might be a good view of what happens with a larger Z, because we're basically going from stock up to a Z of 1. Now I'm also increasing lift. Increased lift increases flow. Increased flow will increase RPM, and so we may have a slight RPM gain. So what I should expect is a slight RPM gain, hopefully not too big, and a gain in volumetric efficiency to where I just picked up railroad track style wise power up here. And that's what I'm kind of hoping for, and we'll have to see what happens. So that's me crunching numbers, and I wish you well in all your projects, and we will talk to you later. Bye.